Hey, there we go. Okay, so just briefly again, I want to make sure that we are doing the right things at the earliest opportunity to make sure, we're not stepping over people as I've put in there, and people are not stepping over us. And the the epic that the issue that I've put in there is one example of two or three things I've heard in conversation and other mediums where um, uh, it's I don't have enough context, but where I see that actually we may be starting to trip over people. So just wanted to have a discussion about that.
Yeah, thank you. I think it's a great call out. From my perspective is I'm not super worried at the moment, given where we are, right? I think we're still learning a lot, at least I am. I think that the time when this becomes maybe a little bit more pressing is when we sort of have our own sort of opinionated proposal and maybe a POC and say like, this is what we think pods look like for those reasons. And I think at that point, we will need to make some choices, right? Because there will be certain things that we say like are going to like actually work and some that are not. I think at that point, it will take sort of product and leadership buy-in on multiple levels. And I think that alignment will probably take some time, right? To be able to say like, yes, this is something that we want to do. Just putting it out there, I think this has pretty gigantic scope on some level. So I don't think we will ship anything like this without buy-in from executive leadership in various forms or shape. My preference would be to start with the proposal when we go out and say like, this is our thinking, right? Because I think that will save us a lot of confusion. But maybe these conversations that you're seeing are also triggered by people just not really like trying to figure it out, essentially, right? And I think that's okay. I don't feel like we have to step onto people's toes. But I think it's a concern. I think it will become very real, let's say in 3 months or 6 months, right? When we say this is just not happening in pods. And then someone will say like, well, but we have these grand plans to ship a dashboard that works in that specific way. And that will take some work to figure out. Sorry, that's a bit rambly, but that's kind of how I feel. So I'm not super worried right now, but I think we may need to be worried a little bit later.
Okay, I do have a manager's call after this as well. I might just start trickling the feed into people's ears and let them know that we're that we're starting to get there. So it starts to be a consideration for people, and they know that something's coming.
I think transparency is key, right? I don't think we need to hide anything, but I'm kind of telling people like, look, this is what we're starting to think about, and then some of them get more nervous than others, I suppose.
Okay, cool.
Omar, Dylan, what do you think?
Definitely agree. The main thing I think is important is to always be highlighting generally that we're a long way out, even when we have a plan. Like this is a fairly long running project, and in particular for teams that are focused on being able to execute things in the near term, we do not want them to feel like they should wait for pods to do something. We at a certain point, we will come up with specific tooling that tells people when they're doing something they're not allowed to do. So Omar has kind of already been thinking about that and good examples of what that'll look like. But much like CID composition, at a certain point, we'll add things to the code base that tell somebody they physically cannot do things, and the communication will be very clear at a point in time. But prior to that point in time, people need to be able to execute, because we don't know what our timeline looks like. So yes, really importantly, scalability in the database team and things like that need to be focused on what they can execute in the near term, and not have any assumption that we're going to offer scalability solutions to any of the immediate problems they have.
So anything from your end, Omar, to add? Or general agreement?
But I imagine like if we are not changing any, if we are not adding or removing features, like organizations or anything, that's just an example. Like, that's the ideal case that I refer to. So whatever teams are building, we are just taking it and replicating it to pods. So I hope that's going to be the case.
Probably not. I think, I mean, this is probably the biggest thing that I'm seeing with, like in some of those discussions, that people have ideas on how certain things are going to work. And I think we're starting, I think at some point with pods, we may, make a statement, say like, these are the features that can work within a certain boundary. And if you pass that, we're going to forbid that, for example, at least in the first iterations, or it needs to work differently, and we have ideas on how that works. And I think when we reach that point and we have confidence that that is a good idea, right, I think this is maybe then one of those proposals where you will need leadership and product buy-in to say like, yes, this is actually the direction that we want to take. And there's more to it than, us making that decision. And I think that's something where I'm still a little bit unsure, sometimes just reading about, for example, workspaces and how they're going to be represented to users and what they are and all of that, right? That becomes a lot more relevant at that point. But we're not quite there yet. We'll get there. Cool. Can we, does that answer your question, Gary? Or like, at least we've discussed your concern.
Yeah, no, that's fine. If it's, I think just my guiding principle will be say the right things at the right time, but as early as possible.
Can't argue with that, I think. Cool. The next one is for me. I've done that today. It's not quite ready to review because I have to spend a little bit more time, but I've started to update some of the language for our sort of first iteration based on some of the discussion that we had in other merge requests. And yeah, just for you to read, you can of course always comment, but I still have to think a little bit about it. I think there's something that's quite interesting that was discussed by Dylan, with sort of the notion of a default pod for users. And maybe we can make our life a little bit easier by at least initially sort of assuming that when users create workspaces, they default to the same pod, right? And users sort of have a strong affinity to a specific pod over others, and that may help us out initially. Yeah, we'll have to see. I'm also starting to come to and this is maybe a little bit rough yet, maybe that for the first iteration, we should definitely aim to aggregate sort of user-centric data. So things that are like belong to users and they care about, like merge requests and to-dos and these kinds of things, but we may not actually, or we may restrict features that cross workspace boundaries in other ways, like sharing groups or associating runners or these kinds of things. So a dashboard, that rolls up some of the information for user may be something that we want to aggregate, and other things maybe not. But I don't know if that's sensible yet. And I've also moved away from this notion that an organization or a user can only create a single workspace. That just doesn't seem to align with reality. So we may have to deal with the fact that many workspaces will exist. Yeah, and users should be global. I think that's something I think we're settling in on as well, right? So we're not going to have separate users for separate pods in different regions. I think that's an assumption that I think I'm comfortable making at the moment, saying like we'll have global users. So
But if that's question like the should be there like default pod for user or not, maybe that's a technical solution, something that might make our job easier. But I think that if we expose the word pod to the user in the interface one way or another, it's gonna be like super confusing for them, because I think the UI is already confusing, and we might be adding workspaces which might confuse them, or it might simplify the UI for them. I like the video that you posted. It was done earlier in February, I think, with the navigation for workspaces.
Yes.
But still, like if we expose that for the users, then it might be.
No, I'll clarify this. I personally would be happiest if we never need to talk about pods with our users. But I don't want to explain that concept to a regular user persona ever. What I want to explain to them eventually is this is what the workspace is and how it behaves, and those are things that are allowed between workspaces or not, right? And this is, I think that is already difficult enough. But I think that maybe for us to move forward, and I think this is a technical detail, right? We have to maybe work with the default pod initially or something, but that's a technical detail. Like maybe I'll make it clear, it's like I don't want users to ever know what pod they're on or having to care.
The concept I added to the technical proposal is a default workspace presented to the user and effectively translated in the backend as a default pod. So the user can only set a default workspace. And in the backend, we'll treat that as a default pod, which is the place that they land when we have no other clues as to which pod to present them with, that present their data from. And on top of that, it would imply we show them in the user interface for certain features. We show them we are a notification. We're only presenting you data from your default workspace. So when they go to / an index page or something, we just have a banner up there saying we are only presenting you with data from your default workspace, so that they understand why that data changed when they navigated somewhere else to look at something else, or why there's a to-do missing on that page, or a merge request missing on that page, or something. That's the conceptual idea. Our proposal has no concrete idea about how we would implement aggregation yet either. So we talk about that being maybe necessary in a first iteration or a later iteration, but so far in my discussions and just even thinking about it, I have no idea about how we would implement aggregation. And that's why, if we have no idea how to implement aggregation, why it would be neat to come up with a solution we could ship that required no aggregation.
Yeah, I think if we wanted to ship an initial iteration without any aggregation, then you're sorry, my daughter is having a fit. What did I want to say? I wanted to say that if we didn't want to have any aggregation, I think we have to have something notifying users that they are within a workspace and they only see data related to that workspace. I think that's what we can do. My slight worry at the moment is that people will want to add something on top of multiple workspaces eventually, right? Like your dashboard and activity across all workspaces, similar to how it is right now. And then we will sooner or later have to figure that out. Right? And I think at least for user data and user dashboards, I think that initially makes sense because they will be most impacted by that. But that's also a UX question, right? And I'm trying to figure out how they actually want to present these workspaces to users. Because if you imagine a future where a workspace is very prominent, to a user as something that they understand is sort of the universe that they care about, and you make the switch to a workspace very explicit, right? Then that's maybe not that much of a problem. Right? It's like people will conceptually get that this is Fabian working in this context, and it's a very clearly defined context, and this is me working in a different context, and they're different things. So maybe that's acceptable, but I'm still trying to figure that out.
Yeah, I had that discussion a little bit with, I think, Tong and maybe Camille, but there's like lots of these features in the GCP UI. And whenever you're navigating Google Cloud in the Google Cloud console, you're just always quite clearly aware of the fact that you're in the context of a project, and sometimes you're in the context of a region, and just, you know, that's just something you kind of get used to in that interface. And it is annoying and quirky at times, because like, well, I'm not seeing something that I know I have access to, but you do just go, okay, well, I need to actually change my project scope to actually see something else. So I could imagine the same thing eventually being true for GitLab. And I could imagine that the way the decisions they've made in their UI to never really aggregate things for the user, or have very limited aggregated views for the user and mostly scope views, probably allows them to implement sharding on the back end gives them a lot of options for implementing sharding on the back end that we never really had, because we didn't ever deliberately scope anything down like that.
Yeah. Well, and I mean, this is something where, like, that's at least my personal opinion right now. I feel that given how complex GitLab is, sort of giving clearer boundaries to users so that they understand their own world and context is maybe even something that's advantageous. And it would allow us nicely to keep things quite separate that should also be separate, right? Like I would, for example, imagine if you have a region's use case, and the reason why people want a second reason is because they don't want data to leave that region for data residency. And your users understand that as well, that this is your UK stuff, then they'd be, I imagine, very okay with the fact that they navigate to a different workspace, you know, that is in the UK, and it just behaves differently because it's like, it is meant to be different. And so, I don't know, but that's a discussion to have.
Yeah, that makes sense. I just wanted to quickly make concrete what I just described before in GCP, because it's useful. Sure. This is what happens when I go to GCP. I'm on the getting started page. I've got up here no project selected, but I'm like, okay, I want to look at my VMs. So I click on Google Compute Engine, and this is where things get a little bit quirky, but explicit. It says GitLab QA resources up here. I never asked for that project, and I have access to lots of these different projects here, but it selected one for me. And I might get confused why when I search, I'm not finding the VM that I thought I had access to, et cetera, but that's ultimately because I'm scoped here.
Yes.
So that's the kind of quirkiness we might expect to come to GitLab eventually, where it's like, I don't know if, like, I have notifications up here. I don't know if these notifications are scoped to this thing, but that might also be the case. And if I have to go to Cloud Shell, this button might behave differently depending on what project I have selected. Even though, like, I never navigated to a project, I never, I thought I'm sort of on an index page here, but it's not an index page of everything.
Yes. Well, and I think the something similar is true for the Google Suite as well, at least to a certain extent, where that is more associated to a different account, right, than a different workspace. But if I'm logged into my GitLab account, then I expect things to be visible for my GitLab account, and then I have my personal account and scope to that, and that's also understandable. That's, I think, how they shard their data as well. Anyways, yeah, I personally think that's maybe how it's going to go, or would go in the pod world, because that would make it pretty clear, what the sharding key is, which is our workspace. That I think, and this is something, at least listening to some of the videos recorded with Sid from, I know, like a while ago, right? The intent was also for a workspace to be very similar in experience to what you would see on a self-managed instance, with the capabilities that are with it. I think that may have shifted a little bit, but ultimately, if the workspace sort of is good enough as a container to sort of have everything inside that you would expect from an instance, then whatever happens in there is fine, right? but you wouldn't necessarily expect that everything can be shared outside your workspace all the time. And I think then you can make it very explicit what the flows are to make that happen, right? Like forking, for example, right? Or maybe you want to aggregate audit logs, or I don't know, some things. That's to be figured out. I think this is maybe where, if we can come in, right, and kind of show people a little bit how that would look like, that would be a strong proposal. And then people would probably be like, oh man, you know, but what about this? What about that? I think Dylan pointed out at some point that that needs a strong sort of direction, product direction as well, because that's a big thing, right, for GitLab. Cool. Oh yeah, and then just for knowledge sharing, that was shared yesterday in the product meeting, which was at 10 p.m. my time, so I couldn't join, and I haven't watched the recording yet, but I think I've unearthed the last workspace roadmap. So you can look at it, and it has some interesting context of what they're trying to do right now. I couldn't see workspaces being as featured as prominently as GitLab, as Dylan just showed in the GCP interface. So that's maybe something that would change in response to pods.
Yeah, that proposal, I feel like, to the extent it matters to us, it feels like the terminology becomes, you know, we move from saying top level namespace to calling them workspaces.
Yes.
Functionality wise, like I am kind of, it doesn't seem to make too much a difference, because practically all the functionality that exists on groups today, it will also exist on workspaces, and it will still exist on groups. And yes, they're going to add more functionality to groups. But the workspace will still be the top level namespace, or effectively this first component in the URL.
Yes.
As far as I can tell. What becomes different in the GCP interface is, like, right now I'm looking at GitLab or GitLab, but I have all this top level bar context, which makes me feel like this bar is out of scope of where I am in the breadcrumbs here, right? So this is like the UX. The GitLab or GitLab, this is my breadcrumb of the context of everything below the purple bar at the top of my page. But everything above the purple bar, I treat this as my global context. I have access to, like, projects that are in a completely different context. And yeah, the difference comparing that to GCP is that the breadcrumb context, the highest level breadcrumb context, is up here in the blue bar. And I assume everything else is scoped to that. So if I click on here, this bar, this UI is so similar to ours, but this is only scoped to GitLab QA resources. Comparing that to GitLab, where this is scoped to me as a user, everything I have access to.
Yes. And I think this is maybe something that would need to change in a pod world where, you know, the workspace context matters more, because things are available within the workspace, but not as much across a workspace. I think that that would be a main sort of UX change, which, you know, yeah, I'm kind of appealed by that, or it appeals to me. I feel that it's cleaner than how it is right now, at least to me. But yeah.
I think, you know, I think GitLab as a company and a GitLab user, we're going to be like the biggest affected by this. And, you know, today I can't add issues to epics that are in the GitLab com project versus the GitLab org project namespace versus the GitLab com namespace. We have this, like, problem, but this is just a small limitation that's implemented in GitLab code, where we say that you can't put issues into epics that belong in a different top level group. But we do make heavy use of linked issues and group sharing and linking and markdown across those GitLab com and GitLab org. And all of these features actually work today for us. So you can link two issues that are in two different top level namespaces. So there'll be, like, all of this list of things that we use today that will be impossible and make our lives more difficult in future because we will have 2 workspaces as a company. And that's something to consider. And then the logical question might be, okay, can we migrate to 1 workspace and move them all into that? And then it will unearth this huge pile of other challenges, if you know, that will reveal to us the challenge with this, right? If you have links, you have 10 years of links in Markdown and comments that are all now pointing to the wrong space because we changed the namespace of every project and group in GitLab. You now have all of this content that is no longer correct.
But the redirection, maybe we can still somehow preserve the redirection. I think we already have this feature for, like, if you rename your username, you can still redirect from the old username. I saw it because I was thinking about changing my username.
Yeah,
so
there might be places where redirection works, but and my example of like links and comments and merge requests and issues is possibly just one of you know, a group of challenges and that redirection may not work in all contexts as well, possibly in Markdown rendering and things like that. So but yeah, that's the kind of challenge I imagine we have to address if we want. There's like different creative ways we solve that. One is like pod 0 allows cross workspace workflows within the whole pod, and then it doesn't matter because you can have as many workspaces as you want within pod 0 and everything keeps working as it works today, which would be ideal because then no customers of pod 0 are going to notice this. But it also means that we have pod 1 behaving quite differently to pod 0, for example, and that's complex application code and confusing user experience.
Yeah, and I think this is something that I just stumbled upon right now. There, of course, these are the things like if you have a self-managed instance and it is allowed to have many workspaces, you know, the URL is likely going to be something like gitlab.customer.com, right, their own instance. And then they say, well, we want to move to SaaS. And they have like their workspaces are named project 1, project 2, right? They will want to move onto gitlab.com/customer workspaces, right? So now you have like an issue where you need to maybe nest workspaces within one or something, right? And like these intricacies then become really interesting to solve, right? And what do you do with that? But yeah, I don't think that's unsolvable, but it is, you know, that's the kind of complexity that we'll have to manage.
Guys, I'm going to need to jump off the call now to go to another one.
Well, it's the end of the call, so we can talk about this for probably we will talk about it for a long time. So
I imagine so.
All right.
I at some point, but we can talk about it later. It's not a big deal.
Bye-bye.
Thanks, everyone.
Bye-bye.